The city was just beginning to stir awake when she stepped out of her apartment. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the streets with golden light, and the air carried that quiet calm that only comes before the rush of a new day. For most people, it was just another morning. For her, it was a ritual of discipline, of balance, of moving through life with purpose. Her name was Danielle Harris. To the world outside, she was simply another black woman driving to work. But within the walls of the bureau, she was an agent, a professional whose decisions could change the course of investigations, whose instincts had saved lives. She carried the weight of that responsibility with grace, though no one could see it as she adjusted her jacket, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. The car rolled out of the apartment complex, smooth and steady. Danielle didn't speed, didn't cut corners, didn't take risks. Years of training and years of life had taught her the value of being meticulous, of leaving no room for mistakes. Her playlist, soft jazz, filled the cabin, soothing her as the city unfolded ahead. To anyone watching, she looked calm. But inside, her thoughts were racing. About the case files on her desk, about the young recruits she was mentoring at the FBI Academy, about her late mother whose voice she still carried in her heart. "Walk with dignity, Danielle," her mother had always said, "even when the world refuses to see your worth." It was advice Danielle had lived by, because she knew that every step she took wasn't just for herself. It was for those who came before her. Her grandparents who had marched for civil rights. Her father who had worked 2 jobs to ensure she could study. Her community who believed in her strength even when society tried to doubt it. This drive to work wasn't just another commute. It was a journey layered with history, resilience, and silent prayers that today would be free from the burden she often carried simply for the color of her skin. The traffic lights turned green, and she eased forward, eyes steady on the road. Everything seemed ordinary, but that was the thing about ordinary mornings. Sometimes, they carried storms waiting just around the corner. And as Danielle checked her rearview mirror, she noticed the sudden flash of red and blue lights behind her. Her heart sank. Her hands gripped the steering wheel just a little tighter. This was the beginning of a chapter she hadn't written for herself, but one she was about to be forced into. The flashing lights grew closer, washing over her rearview mirror in relentless bursts of red and blue. Danielle's first thought wasn't guilt. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Her speed was steady. Her turn signals had been exact. She had obeyed every single law of the road. Yet her heart pounded anyway, because in that moment, she wasn't Danielle Harris, the FBI agent. She wasn't the woman who had passed federal training with top scores. She was simply a black woman being pulled over, and she knew exactly what that could mean. Danielle flicked on her signal and eased her car to the side of the road. She took a slow breath, the way she had taught younger recruits to do when fear threatened to take over. Stay calm. Stay in control. Own the moment, she reminded herself, though her chest was tight. In the mirror, she saw him. A white police officer stepping out of his cruiser. His walk was brisk, sharp, carrying not just authority but something heavier. Something that felt like judgment before a word had even been exchanged. He approached her car window, his hand resting firmly on his holster, his eyes narrowed. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Danielle lowered her window, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle him. She spoke clearly, respectfully. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" "I was driving." "License. Registration." He cut her off again, louder this time, sharper. She stopped speaking. Years of experience had taught her how quickly escalation could come, not from her actions, but from how her actions might be perceived. She reached for her documents, handed them over, and kept her hands visible on the wheel. The officer snatched the papers from her grasp without thanks, scanning them with a look of suspicion. His tone dripped with contempt as he asked questions that weren't questions at all. Accusations wrapped in words. "Where you headed this early? You in a hurry for something? You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The words stung, but Danielle's face didn't flinch. She had heard variations of them before, in grocery stores, in airports, in places where she was expected to shrink into silence. But silence, to her, was not weakness. It was strength. It was survival. She waited, letting him finish his barrage, saying nothing more than what was necessary. The humiliation was familiar, but it was no less heavy. The unfairness hung in the air like smog, choking, invisible, inescapable. Finally, after an unnecessary delay, the officer shoved her documents back at her. "Next time, watch yourself," he muttered before turning away. Danielle sat still for a moment, gripping the wheel, her jaw tight. She wanted to tell him who she was. She wanted to tell him that she wore a badge too, one with far more weight than his. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she started her car, pulled back onto the road, and drove on. Her face was calm, but her heart carried the sting of disrespect. She didn't know it yet, but this morning encounter would not remain hidden in the shadows of routine. The ripples of this moment were just beginning to spread. And soon, the officer who thought he had power over her would realize how wrong he was. The stop should have been over. A few minutes of inconvenience, a bitter taste left behind, and life would have carried on. But sometimes, power is not content with silence. It needs to push further, to remind its target of who supposedly holds control. The officer didn't return to his cruiser immediately. Instead, he lingered by her window, his stance rigid, his stare cutting. "You know," he began, his voice low but edged with authority, "I see a lot of people like you out here, always dressed sharp, always acting like you've got nothing to hide. But the truth always comes out. It always does." Danielle's eyes remained forward, fixed on the horizon, her hands steady at the wheel. She didn't answer, because she understood the trap. He wanted a reaction, something to justify his treatment, something to twist into a reason for escalation. When her silence stretched, he leaned closer. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? You don't think you need to answer a police officer when he's talking to you?" His words carried more than irritation, they carried presumption. The presumption that she was beneath him, that her voice was less, that her dignity could be stripped away with a uniform and a badge. Danielle inhaled slowly, letting the breath fill her chest before she exhaled again. "Calm. Always calm. Officer," she said evenly. "With respect, I've complied with everything you asked. If there's nothing further, may I leave now?" Her tone was steady, professional, the kind of voice that should have disarmed tension. But instead, it only fueled his disdain. He chuckled under his breath. "Oh, you think you're clever, huh? Talking to me like you're above this, like you're better than the rest." The words sliced deeper than they should have, not because of their cruelty, but because of the weight they carried, the centuries-old assumption embedded in them. That no matter her success, no matter her achievements, in his eyes, she would never be more than just another black woman to belittle. Finally, with a shake of his head, he stepped back. "Go on," he muttered, dismissing her like she was less than human. Danielle pulled away, her movements measured, refusing to let anger take control of her. But inside, the fire burned. It wasn't just about her. It was about every time someone like her had been told to shrink, to bow, to accept disrespect in silence. The drive to work was quiet now, the jazz music no longer soothing. Instead, her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Walk with dignity, Danielle, even when the world refuses to see your worth." By the time she reached the FBI headquarters, her expression was unreadable, her posture straight. She carried herself like the agent she was. But the encounter clung to her like a shadow, reminding her that respect was still a battle to be fought every day. What Danielle didn't know was that the man who had belittled her would not escape the weight of his actions. Because fate has a way of revealing truths, and the very system he thought he embodied would soon turn its gaze back on him. The morning unfolded at FBI headquarters with its usual rhythm. Agents moving briskly through the halls, briefings echoing in conference rooms, the hum of printers and ringing phones blending into a steady symphony of urgency. Danielle walked in with her usual composure, her chin high, her steps firm. To anyone watching, she was unshaken. But beneath the surface, the memory of the traffic stop lingered, an ember smoldering quietly in her chest. She greeted colleagues, exchanged files, and slipped into the flow of work. She didn't mention what had happened on the road. She didn't need to. Her dignity had already carried her past it. But outside the FBI walls, a different story was beginning to brew. The officer from that morning, still wearing his misplaced pride, drove through the city unaware of the storm approaching him. When he returned to his precinct later that day, he logged his traffic stop as routine. Another name, another face, another entry in his record. To him, it was nothing. Just another moment where he had flexed authority without accountability. But accountability has a way of catching up. Hours later, during a coordinated briefing between local police and federal law enforcement, the officer found himself in a conference room he didn't usually enter. He was there to provide information on a case that required both departments to share intelligence. He sat casually, waiting, flipping through notes, when the doors opened, and in walked Agent Danielle Harris, the same woman he had pulled over, the same woman he had spoken down to, dismissed and disrespected. Her presence hit him like a tidal wave. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat, his pen slipping from his hand. The air in the room seemed to thicken as his mind raced back to the morning, the words he had thrown, the contempt in his voice. But now the roles were reversed. Danielle didn't look at him immediately. She addressed the room with authority, briefing her team with precision and clarity. She commanded respect not through force, but through the natural gravity of her presence. When her eyes finally swept across the table and landed on him, she didn't flinch, didn't gloat, didn't even allow herself the satisfaction of a smirk. She looked at him the way a storm looks at a trembling tree, calm, inevitable, unbothered by resistance. The officer's chest tightened. His earlier arrogance began to feel like a weight he couldn't shake off. Because now, the truth was undeniable. The woman he had belittled wasn't just someone on the side of the road. She was a federal agent, a leader, a protector of justice. And he was the one who had failed to embody the very principles his badge was meant to uphold. From that moment on, his world shifted. What had been an ordinary abuse of power to him was now a crack in his career, one that would only grow wider with time. For Danielle, the revelation wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about him. It was about truth. A truth that had always been there. No matter how many tried to strip away her worth, her strength was undeniable. But for the officer, it was the beginning of regret. The kind of regret that doesn't fade because it comes from realizing the damage wasn't done to someone faceless. It was done to someone unforgettable. And soon, the cost of that mistake would come knocking. News of injustice has a way of traveling. Quietly at first, like ripples across a pond, then louder, faster, until it becomes a wave that can no longer be ignored. For the officer, the traffic stop had been routine. Another box checked, another encounter brushed aside. But what he didn't account for was the eye of the camera, the silent witness clipped to his own uniform. His body cam had recorded every second. The sharpness in his tone, the disrespect in his words, the dismissal of Danielle's calm, measured presence. At first, the footage was just another file in the department system. But in law enforcement, nothing remains hidden forever. Supervisors reviewed it. Colleagues whispered about it. And when word reached federal ears that an FBI agent had been harassed and belittled during a routine stop, silence was no longer an option. The conversations started in hushed tones. "Did you hear what happened this morning?" He didn't even know who she was. Body cam footage doesn't lie. Danielle herself said nothing. She didn't need to. She had never been a woman of theatrics. She was a woman of action, of integrity. And her silence spoke louder than any protest ever could. It wasn't about her personal dignity anymore. It was about the principle. If this could happen to her, an FBI agent, what about those who didn't wear a badge? What about those who didn't have the protection of a federal title behind their name? The precinct began to feel the weight of it. Senior officers called meetings. The chief's face grew tight with concern. Complaints were filed, and for once, they couldn't be brushed aside. Not this time. Not when the target of disrespect carried the kind of credibility that could not be denied. Beyond the walls of the department, the whispers grew louder. Community leaders caught wind. Journalists asked questions. Civil rights advocates demanded answers. The story was no longer about a single traffic stop. It became a mirror, reflecting the broader, painful truth about power, bias, and the silent battles fought daily on city streets across America. And in the center of it all stood Danielle Harris. She hadn't asked for this role, but she carried it with the same steadiness she carried everything in her life. She showed up to work each day, focused on her cases, mentoring young agents, living with the same dignity that had been tested but never broken. The officer, on the other hand, could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His fellow officers avoided eye contact. His name was muttered in hallways with tones of disapproval. He knew the truth. His actions were no longer his secret. The world was beginning to watch. Regret gnawed at him, sharper with each passing day. He tried to convince himself it had been nothing, that maybe he had just been doing his job. But the footage told another story. And deep down, he knew it wasn't about the law that morning. It was about his assumptions, his prejudice, his misuse of authority. The ripples were spreading, and soon they would crash into him with full force. Because disrespect may be dismissed in silence at first, but it always leaves echoes. Regret has a way of growing heavier when silence surrounds it. For the officer, the silence of his colleagues, the silence of his superiors, even the silence of Danielle herself. It all pressed against him like an invisible wall. At first, he tried to rationalize it. He told himself he'd only been asserting authority, that she'd acted suspicious, that his words had been sharp, yes, but not unforgivable. But deep down, the truth gnawed at him. It wasn't about law or duty or safety. It was about his own bias, his own misuse of power. And the world had seen it. The bodycam footage had now been reviewed by more than just his precinct. The FBI had weighed in, their report precise and unforgiving. Internal Affairs had opened a file. Community voices grew louder, demanding accountability, not just for him, but for what he represented. And so, with pressure building and his career hanging by a thread, he decided to do the only thing he thought might save him. He tried to apologize. One morning, he walked into the federal building where Danielle worked. His uniform looked sharper than usual, his steps rehearsed, but his confidence had withered. Each corridor he walked down reminded him of the gulf between them, not of rank, but of integrity. He found her in the hallway, surrounded by colleagues, briefing two young recruits. She stood tall, her voice steady, her presence commanding. For a moment he hesitated, almost turning back. But pride and desperation pushed him forward. "Agent Harris," he said, his voice low, strained. She turned, calm eyes meeting his. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply regarded him with the same composure she had shown on the roadside. I just want to say," his words stumbled, falling apart before they could form. "That morning, I didn't realize, I didn't know who you were." Danielle's gaze didn't soften. Her reply was measured, unwavering. "That's exactly the point, officer. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The hallway fell silent. The recruits looked on, wide-eyed. The weight of her words landed like stone. He swallowed hard, his apology collapsing under the truth she had laid bare. For a moment he wanted to plead, to explain, to beg for understanding. But he saw in her eyes that it was too late. Not because she was cruel, but because some lessons can't be undone once the damage has been dealt. When he finally turned to leave, his shoulders sagged, his steps heavy. The walls that had once echoed with his confidence now felt like a prison closing in. Danielle, meanwhile, turned back to her recruits, her tone calm, her words steady, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a passing moment. Because for her, it was never about him. It was about the principle, the dignity, the truth. And for him, that truth had become a reckoning. Because sometimes, regret doesn't end with forgiveness. Sometimes it ends with consequences. The walls of the precinct had grown colder for him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Eyes turned away, whispers followed him down hallways. The authority he once wielded so carelessly was slipping, piece by piece. out of his grasp. The investigations moved quickly now. The FBI had filed their report, and Internal Affairs had completed theirs. The body cam footage, undeniable, unedited, spoke louder than any excuse he could muster. Every word, every sneer, every ounce of contempt was preserved in digital clarity. The decision was handed down in a quiet office, but the weight of it thundered through his life. He was stripped of his badge, stripped of his uniform, stripped of the very symbol of power he had once used as a shield. There was no grand speech, no dramatic confrontation, just a signature on paper, a meeting with the chief, and the cold reality of accountability. He walked out of the building not as an officer, but as a man who had failed, not only his oath but himself. The punishment didn't end with the loss of his career. His name was etched into reports, his reputation tarnished. The community he once claimed to protect now remembered him not for service, but for abuse of authority. He became an example, a warning, a lesson taught in training rooms about what happens when prejudice overtakes duty. And Danielle? She did not celebrate his fall. That was never her way. She continued her work with the same steadiness as before. But those around her, her colleagues, her recruits, her community, saw her more clearly now. Not as a victim, but as a pillar of strength. A woman who had endured disrespect without crumbling, and whose dignity had turned into a mirror that reflected the truth back at the system. Justice had been delivered not through anger, not through revenge, but through accountability. And accountability at last had a name, a face, a consequence. For the officer, it was the end of a career. For Danielle, it was another reminder that resilience wasn't just survival, it was triumph. And for everyone watching, it was a lesson carved deep into memory. The badge is not a license to disrespect. Authority is not power without responsibility. Respect is not optional. The city carried on, as cities always do. Traffic flowing, people rushing, lives intertwining in countless unseen ways. But for those who had witnessed the story of Danielle Harris and the officer who disrespected her, something had shifted. It wasn't just about one morning on the side of the road. It wasn't just about one officer's fall. It was about something deeper, something that echoed far beyond a single encounter. Danielle walked through the FBI headquarters with the same steady grace as always, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. To the outside world, nothing had changed. She was still an agent, still a mentor, still a woman carrying the weight of her duty with quiet pride. But inside, she knew something had been proven, not just to her, but to everyone watching. The truth was simple. Dignity is stronger than disrespect. Calm is stronger than cruelty. And justice, though slow, can still find its way. For the officer, his regret came too late. His career was gone, his authority stripped away. He had learned, painfully, that power built on arrogance is fragile. That a single moment of disrespect can undo years of service. And that apologies spoken too late cannot undo harm already done. For Danielle, the lesson was not new. She had lived it her whole life. She had carried the burden of assumptions, of prejudice, of silent battles that many would never see. But she had also carried resilience, an unshakable belief in her worth, in her strength, in her right to be treated with respect. And that resilience had turned an act of humiliation into a story of justice. The community saw it too. People whispered her name not as a victim, but as a symbol, a reminder that strength does not always shout. Sometimes, it stands quietly, unbroken, until the world has no choice but to notice. As the sun set on another long day, Danielle sat at her desk, her mother's words echoing once again in her mind. Walk with dignity, Danielle, even when the world refuses to see your worth. She smiled faintly, because she knew now what she had always known. Dignity is not given by others. It is carried within. And when you hold it firmly, no amount of disrespect can take it away. The story ended not with bitterness, but with truth. Not with revenge, but with resolve. And the message lingered long after the last word was spoken. Respect is not a privilege. It is a right.